Okay, action. Good afternoon. Pavlos Protopavas, and I'm the Scientific Program Director of the Institute for Applied Computational Science. I welcome you all. I hope you enjoy the good Mexican food. Kind of appropriate with our speaker. You go with the speakers. So before I introduce Alan, a couple of announcements. The next seminar is on March 27, and is Jeff Bilms from University of Washington. He will be talking about how to summarize large data sets. Follow that is April 10, Bhutendra Baduri from Oak Ridge, and he's talking again about big data, but in this time for geospatial computing. The important thing is that the next seminar, which is March 27, is not going to happen here. We have the open house at CIS, so we have been moved to the Science Center, Room E. Center. So find your way to the Science Center, and it's in the lower floor, I think, the basement. We don't say the word basement, we say lower floor. So today I'm introducing Alan. He's a professor of chemistry. I think he doesn't need much introduction, but a few words. Alan has done his PhD in chemistry at University of Berkeley, postdoc University of Berkeley, and then in 2006 came to Harvard, and then in 2013 became a full professor, 12, somewhere there, right? Yeah. He leads the lab, sizable lab. His work is in quantum computing and quantum Monte Carlo, which I never know what it is, and one day I'll learn. He has numerous awards that I want to point out. One, he has got the award as a best mentor at Harvard. I think that's the one he's most proud of it. And MIT TR35, which is a very prestigious award. So today, Alan is talking about billions and billions of molecules, and I don't want to take more time. Everybody knows Alan. Thank you, Alan.
Oh, thank you, Pablos. It's very, very nice to be just across the street to give a talk, and also to be able to do something that I can never do when I'm traveling, which is acknowledge my group in person for the work they have done to make this thing possible. So there's many group members here. Can you raise your hand? All these people that are raising their hand, they are actually the people that did the work, and I'll try to acknowledge them as I go along because I see their faces, okay? Or also you could just wave your hand if you did the work and I didn't mention you, right? So that's something that is unique to have them here, and I thank them in public. And of course the first thing that could happen is that my clicker doesn't click. Okay. So if you really think about the challenges of the 21st century, just in general, you could pick up your favorite ones. I mean, for me, one of the most important ones is clean energy. But you could think about also antibacterial drugs. We have drug-resistant bacteria. You can think about challenges in water purification and in other areas. You might identify that many of those challenges actually involve molecules and materials. And of course, it's not really clear that the materials that we have today or the molecules that we have today are actually the optimal ones. Right? Can we improve upon them? And is the performance of these molecules crucial for the actual process that we're interested in? It's also a big question mark. But to put things in context, I think it is clear that many of these challenges will benefit from better types of materials. So this talk mentions something called chemical space. So why don't we just become with regular space? Does anybody know how many molecules or atoms are in visible space, roughly? Order of magnitude? So space in terms of molecules or atoms is about 10 to the 82 atoms in the observable universe. Okay? So that's roughly a number that you want to take in mind of if you were to enumerate each one of the possible atoms just out there. So just mass, okay, number of them. Well, if you think about the chemical space, which will be the number of possible molecules I can make, and if you think about molecules as Lego pieces, you have this combinatorial explosion of all the possible ways you can put all these different molecular groups together, right? And of course, there's a large variety of estimations of this space. And if you just want to think about the number of synthesizable, accessible organic compounds, and you do a literature survey, you find out that there is an error bar of about 120 orders of magnitude in the estimation of this space. Okay? But in other words, it's a very large space. Okay? And it's actually, if you think about these estimates, it's actually larger than the number of atoms visible. Right? So perhaps it's likely that in that practically infinite space, there are very interesting compounds, right, that might be useful for these challenges. So my group and I are thinking about what does it mean to actually search this very large space for useful compounds. So what are the tools that we've been mostly employing? But for that, let me just tell you two different challenges. One, I noticed I just deleted a slide, but I'll just mention the idea in that slide. One of the most ambitious challenges will be something like that. I mean, imagine that I have some sort of sampler of chemical space, and every time I can pick a molecule from chemical space and actually catalog that molecule as a useful molecule for A, B, C, or D, right? Maybe for energy storage, or for energy production, or as an antibacterial, or whatever use you want, right? And somehow hold that in a database, all my cool molecules, right? So that's kind of like a more general, broad, unsupervised search of chemical space, right? Or supervised, but not as carefully. And that's something that we're interested on. But a more practical approach and what we're doing today, nowadays, is looking for a particular property. For example, if I give you a molecule, is this molecule going to be good as an Ebola drug, good for solar cells, and good for solar energy? But more importantly, instead of thinking of chemical space as such a large entity, we carve a piece of it, and I'll tell you more about that in a second. Okay? So it is this concept of structure-property relationships that is crucial to the success of such approaches. Okay? So if you want to think about the tools that we use for molecular screening, two of them are quantum mechanics. We do quantum mechanical calculations, and we also use machine learning approaches. So let's just discuss a little bit about them. And with these two, for example, I'll show you an example how we could, for example, figure out if this molecule is good or bad as a solar cell material. So quantum mechanics, well, Huckel, a very famous quantum chemist, was one of the first people that actually built a code to actually look at organic molecules and try to calculate their properties. And I found this quote about him, right? So he can do quite a few calculations. I think this is relevant to this talk. But then what does the wave function really mean? Okay, so this is an old quote that reminds you just the mysterious nature of quantum mechanics. For us, it's a numerical method that unfortunately we cannot solve exactly. We need to actually employ approximations. And to correct those approximations, we employ machine learning. And Bill Gates, which I think is relevant to this building, says that a breakthrough in machine learning will be worth 10 Microsofts. I think that's probably true already. If you think about Google as a machine learning company, right? One company that actually embodies machine learning, I think this quote is actually starting to become a reality. So now the challenge of sifting through chemical space, you can think about the fact that, say, we use the most conservative estimate of chemical space of accessible organic compounds, about 10 to the 60. Well, our computers nowadays, even Harvard's mighty Odyssey supercomputer, can only probably sift for about 1 million molecules for each project. Okay? 1 million or so. So if you want a screen of order of magnitude 1 million of molecules, right, you have to have an intelligent way of cutting, these 10 orders of magnitude, dividing the orders of magnitude from 60 to 10, right? Sorry, these 54 orders of magnitude, right? So you wanna cut down the infinite chemical space to what we like to call an initial screening library of about 10 to the 6. Then you will actually employ computational methods, and of course you want to think about computational methods that are very cheap and inexpensive that can allow you to sift for a first possible layer and then go to a next layer and the next layer. And eventually the most important aspect of this, and my collaborator Roy Gordon here is present, actually he's one of the people that I work with very closely about this, is the fact that eventually we have to work with them and listen to experimentalists to figure out what you're going to be making, testing, and then going back to the device, right? So they are actually basically the crucial aspect of the whole scheme, because first of all, if you don't design your initial library correctly, they won't want to make it. It will be useless, and I will argue many of the theoretical efforts around the world that are trying to screen materials don't consider experiment as seriously as they should. Okay, so we should always think about experimental synthesis and testing, and the measurements from those experimental synthesis and testing come back and help us refine our initial libraries and computational screening and so on. So in my group, we have done a few things, and actually I've given a talk here before in IACS, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, about this Hogwild Clean Energy project, which I will tell you an update about. I will tell you about our work. Actually, I mentioned already Roy Gordon in our organic flow batteries project. Then I will mention very briefly some of the work that we're doing now to try to find new organic light-emitting diodes. And I won't mention to you today, but many of the group members that work on that, like Dimitri Rapoport sitting here, we're using the same tools to think about how a life might come about. Okay, so feel free to talk to us and Dimitri about it after the talk if you're interested in that. So if you want to think about organic materials, or materials that are made mainly of organic molecules, right? You want to think about them first in the context of where do they stand in the country. And this administration did something very exciting, which is basically launched what is called the Materials Genome Initiative about 3 years ago or so, where the nation identified as a very interesting research direction where they can actually take advantage of all our investments in computational tools, our investments on big data, and of course there's also a big data initiative in the nation now, right? And of course I mentioned experiment already, having experiment at the same footing to try to solve problems relevant to the nation. For example, clean energy problems, human welfare problems like health, national security, and next generation workforce. There are very interesting problems in the materials genome space. For example, trying to replace these rare earth materials, right, that are in many electronics, and they are dominated by pretty much a single country. Right? So how can we replace them by abundant materials? And now, we work in my group in organic materials. So again, molecules. There's of course a very exciting and pioneering and efforts, for example, the materials project for JRC there at MIT on inorganic materials. Okay? And the size of these arrows doesn't mean that the project is more or less exciting, but it tells you how much we know about the number of descriptors that you want to have a handle on. In solid-state materials, we have less number of descriptors. If you think about alloys and this type of materials, actually the size of shell space is actually way smaller than organic materials. And they basically have to deal with very low approximations, okay? Pharma is actually a very, they can do accurate calculations. So in the case of pharma, on the other hand, if you want to figure out how a molecule crosses the blood-brain barrier and so on, you have to make huge approximations in your models and use a lot of cheminformatics. But there are tons of descriptors that people have developed, and this is the oldest of the fields on this. And organic materials is somewhere in between these two, and that's the field that we work on, and it's not as crowded and has many opportunities. Okay? So an example. So the first thing we did, I wish I was more successful at telling you many more examples, right? I don't know many theory groups that actually have even a single success story like this one. It's kind of sad that a lot of computational chemists really don't go and say, okay, let's try to make something. So the first one that we were able to do was to try to modify an organic semiconductor material that we found in the literature that looked really good, and did a screening of 8 other possible materials, predicted their crystal structure, collaborated with Jianan Bao at Stanford University, and predicted the crystal structure that looks like this. And then this is the actual crystal made of the molecule that we took in the computer, so from carbon, so this is wrong, from in silico to carbon to device. And then turns out it was to be the second highest hole mobility material back then, around 2011. Now there are higher hole mobility materials, and we could do this again. But this was a screening of about 8 molecules, but at least validates the fact that with theory and using your brain to reduce the size of 10 to the 60 to about 8, right, you're able to actually come up with a good material. And this is a good material for example, having conductive plastics, okay, or conductive organic electronics. So now, the oldest project that we've been running on this vein is called the Hogwild Clean Energy Project. One of the visions for the Hogwild Clean Energy Project is having tools like this. For example, a bag that charges your cell phone. I think is something extremely useful for us in the developed world. Or, for example, freeways covered with these canopies of light harvesting materials, parking lots, building integrated photovoltaics. The company that actually did this roll-to-roll processing here in Massachusetts actually is now bankrupt, or basically they went out of business. There's many challenges to actually try to commercialize these organic materials, for example, lifetime. I still believe, though, that organic photovoltaic materials have a very good space, for example, here in the developing world. There's 1.5 billion of people, 1.4 billion of people that have no electricity. And you could imagine that having a very flexible panel made of organic materials in the rooftop, or having organic light-emitting diodes help them power at night, give them light at night, is actually an interesting space to help. And the dollars for the first watt might not be as crucial. This is actually pictures from Sheila Kennedy at MIT that did some projects with these flexible photovoltaics. This is a Huichol woman in Mexico making a solar poncho. Okay? So that's the type of things that I think will be useful for organic photovoltaic materials. Or this gentleman here actually using this $20 or so device to make a phone call. So how does an organic solar cell work? Well, they work like inorganic solar cells, but they are different in the sense that they are made of organic materials and they are disordered. Okay, they are basically a blend. I'll show you an animation of that made by one of my former students. You have usually a blend of two layers. In one layer, you will get the formation of electron-hole pairs. These electron-hole pairs will migrate to an interface where they will dissociate. The electron will go to one of the layers. The hole will remain in the other. And when you close a circuit, you actually have a photovoltaic. So one of our goals in the Clean Energy Project is to find good materials for these layers. And how can you think of those materials? Well, you want to think about their energetic levels. HOMO means highest occupied molecular orbital, and LUMO means lowest unoccupied molecular orbital. There are different constraints on these energy levels that actually, for example, your HOMO has to be lower than that of oxygen, so your material is actually stable in air. And your LUMO has to be about 0.3 electron volts above the acceptor's LUMO to be able to have enough free energy to dissociate that electron. And those are the ideal molecular energy levels, assuming that you're using a C60 type acceptor. If you modify the acceptor, then you have to find, again, a different HOMO-LUMO levels that actually satisfy these criteria. So this is an animation made by a former Harvard undergraduate about this. Her name is Lauren Kay, and now she works in scientific animation. So this is basically an electron-hole pair in her imagination of the device, although the actual morphology of this device was obtained from us, obtained by Jenny Nelson. She gave it to us. She's a modeler that actually simulated this blend. You see here the exciton arriving to the interface with this acceptor, which is a fullerene, just a dramatic rotation just for animation purposes. And now you see the electrons stay and the hole move around. So now one of the challenges of trying to screen for photovoltaics here is the fact that a lot of the properties of these devices actually has to do with how well you blend this, which is a very experimental property. We're going to zoom out and show you what I mean. You have about domains of about 10 or so nanometers that you need to have blended appropriately, okay, and actually have percolation in those kind of islands of 10 nanometers. So basically, they're more like 10 nanometers like spaghettis that actually connect your two electrodes to the blend so that you have actually the mobility of the carriers all the way down to the two electrodes. Turns out that you can do something about this as well with machine learning, or try to learn what are the possible good structure property relationships to actually predict this blend. But I do not work on explicit multi-scale simulations of this nature, of the blend itself. So now, if you actually think about just those two energy levels, a model from 2006 by Marcus Sharber, it's a very simple model of photovoltaic efficiency, assuming that you have this fullerene-like acceptor. The band gap of the donor, which is basically the distance between the HOMO and LUMO I was showing you earlier, and the level of the LUMO for the donor, predicts a region of high efficiency of about 10% efficiency somewhere around here. So that's the green target that we're after. Okay? So what we did, we worked with Shannon Bao at Stanford to actually come up with 26 building blocks at different places where they can link and fuse to actually combinatorially search the space. So this is one way of making a library. There's other ways that you could imagine making a library. In this case, we were very liberal. We said, let's take these 26 fragments, let's combine them, not necessarily paying that much attention to the synthesizability of these fragments yet, build a library of about 3 million molecules, and then screen it. So how do we screen it? Well, we use volunteer distributed computing, such as this project like the SETI at home, which I was a fan of when I was an undergrad back in Mexico, because I was very excited about, not necessarily about searching for aliens, but about the technology that allows people to help compute with free CPU cycles around the world. So in some sense, this is some form of ring computing, because you delocalize your compute and use rather otherwise unused cycles to actually compute. one of the big things you want to do is give a very nice picture to your users. For example, this picture is a Fourier transform of the sky pretty much for the SETI project. So we did the same thing. Originally started with many group members of mine, but Johannes Hachmann was spearheading it for a while. Now Ed Pisser-Knapp, which is here somewhere, I assume. If not, Ed, are you here? No? Well, Ed actually is doing something useful. Maybe he's working for the Clean Energy Project right now. And Genam. So this is basically the Clean Energy Project. You can go ahead and download our screensaver and help us. Okay? So, of course, what we do is something like this. We develop this screensaver. This is actually the quantum mechanical fog matrix as it's being diagonalized for the molecule. Here is our logo, IBM. There's many partners, by the way. IBM is an organization via the World Community Grid that runs the entire set of calculations. And this allowed us to do what we believe is the largest quantum chemistry experiment ever done to date. This is about 500,000 quantum calculations in a database stored here in Harvard. Okay? It's about a petabyte of quantum chemistry data, accessible to anybody that wants to do anything with it. Okay? And roughly, we calculate 25,000 molecules a day, and we have computed for about 30,000 CPU years. Okay? That's imagining starting a computer back when there were mammoths around and just run that machine for so long. Okay? So again, Lauren made this beautiful animation of to try to explain to the public what we do then. Each person gets a random fragment for these molecules from our database. It takes about 12 hours to do all the quantum chemistry calculations that we want to do on that fragment. And then they will get it in their banana computers. And then those computers will actually be trying to find the one that gets the golden ticket. So this is kind of like a generation one type of idea in our group, in the sense that we defined a library, we went and did a massive screening of it, but we didn't iterate as quickly. Now we're changing the project to make it much more interactive. But for example, imagine this person actually gets the golden ticket, and again, you can go there, download our project, etc. Okay, so let me just show you some of the results and some of the ways of improving this project. So I'm showing you in this paper the data for 2.3 million molecules. Here is the Sharper plot that I was telling you about. And this is the logarithm of number of molecules. Okay, so this is probably the first time somebody ever plots number of molecules calculated with quantum chemistry in a log scale. Okay, and the area where you have about a 10% solar cell efficiency, which is here, and that area is about 35,000 molecules. So that's really exciting. Now we have 35,000 molecules for people to try to make organic solar cells. Well, what is the issue? First of all, that I don't want to show this plot too much to my donors of computer time, because they will first think, oh my God, most of us spent a lot of our time computing very bad solar cells. Okay, this is only the good ones. That's the first thing that you want to think about. And the second thing that you want to think about is maybe you learn something about this. If you're an organic chemist and you're trying to make solar cells, most of the papers that you see in the literature are about here, 4, 3, or 5% efficient. Because I think what they're doing is they're sampling more or less from the same fragments, using their brain to think their solar cell is going to work, but not necessarily are going to be as intuitive, have good intuition, and therefore will remain in the bulk of solar cells that are around here. So the bulk of our screening more or less coincides with the publication solar cell efficiencies that are out there. Okay? So in other words, computers might allow us to actually go and sidestep this random sampling and actually enrich the sampling. So if you look at our statistical enrichment or depletion of fragments, you can see that there are some guidelines for experimentalists. Maybe we suggest to them that maybe they could make fragments primarily from these green molecules and avoid these red ones that we see that in our database and seem to be the worst performers. So there's some information there for our experimental colleagues. Okay? So what are we doing in 2014 that is different? Well, a couple of things. The first thing that we're doing is that we're actually training machine learning models to be able to sift through these molecules before we send them to our donors. So once we train a good machine learning model, the machine learning model in milliseconds can tell you if the molecule is good or bad with a very high degree of confidence, right? Which basically means that we can calculate enough molecules, learn them, prioritize, okay? And then just send to our donors the best molecules. Okay, so the CPU donors will only be screening now an enriched space. So this is actually a huge improvement of the Clean Energy Project. Another thing that I will touch base later, because this is one of the biggest things that my group is thinking about, is what are the computational tools to actually make only easy to synthesize molecules. Chemical space is too large. It's not worth it to search molecules that nobody's going to make. right? So that's another thing that we learned along the way. So you have to always be thinking about making molecules that are easy to synthesize. There's still an infinite amount of them, so you might as well search over the things that you can actually make in the lab easily. As my group members like to say, you can always make an arbitrarily complex molecule for an arbitrarily cost. If you really want to make a molecule A that is super complicated, it might cost you millions of dollars to make it. And it would be 20 steps of synthesis, right? We're talking about molecules that are very easy to make with few steps of synthesis, etc. So how do we do the machine learning? Just a few slides on that. We use neural networks. So neural networks are modeled, roughly about how our brain works. We have these things called neurons that have these nonlinear activation functions. So inputs come to them, and then if there's enough feedback on the neuron, then it will fire. This nonlinear function will activate, and then feed onto the next neuron. And you can actually train these neural networks on input layers, for example, a molecular structure, and then to the output, for example, a molecular energy, a HOMO level, or whatever property you want. I have to say that I collaborate heavily on this with my colleague Ryan Adams. Maybe some of his group members are here. He's a member of the CIS, School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. So some of the things that my group has been doing is actually how to parallelize the training of these neural networks. And then also, another important thing that we used that we found it was very useful is to train our neural network against many targets. And it makes sense. The neurons become way less specialized. They need to actually do double work. The neural network has to actually say, this molecule should be good for this and for that. And we have found that is very important for making our neural networks robust. Okay? So this Hogwild algorithm that we implemented in my group is actually quite cool. It's actually a way of parallelizing the training of the neural network that allowed actually Kwei, an undergraduate from the college that worked with Ed Paisernap, to train our network in 2 hours instead of about 2 weeks. Okay? So it allows us to train 200,000 molecules in about 2 hours. And what it basically does is kind of like a dirty parallelization of updating the network without synchronization. Okay? So it's a very interesting parallelization algorithm by itself. And again, based on the work of Geoff Hinton, we actually train on multiple targets at once. And this actually helps us regularize or make our network much more stable and, again, reduce overfitting. So with that, tell you a little bit more details about it. We train again in about 200,000 data points from the Clean Energy Project. Okay, again, we have a couple million. Then we use pharma-like fingerprinting tools, basically a way of converting a molecular structure into a binary bit string. Okay, and they're very easy to calculate. You can take those 200,000 molecules and get a bit string associated with their molecular structure. It's only two-dimensional, and again, it's pharma-based. But then we train on that against the properties using Hogwild, and in about 2 hours, you come up with something like this. Okay? You have the calculated value, for example, for that highest occupied molecular orbital versus the predicted value. You can see this correlation here. What is really nice about it is that you see the spread is not so bad, right? So then you can do something like this. You can throw away all the structures in this area because we have an infinite space, and only send to our colleagues, our donors of computer time, molecules that are actually useful. Notice that there's some sort of weird stuff happening here around 0. That's normal, and that's part of the network. You can ask Ed Paisernap more about it. Okay? So but we see that in a lot of our machine learning. When you machine learn around 0, you get this junk here. So now, what are we doing with this? I think this is also very important to think about it when you do computational science. You want to, and this is also part of the materials genome ideals. You want to take these molecules and actually give them back to the public. In this particular case, it's very relevant because they donated the computer time in the first place, right? So therefore, we have this place called molecularspace.org that we're actually seeking to expand and to make much more robust and to make it the place where people can actually deposit such data sets. So right now, in all my free time, I'm writing a DOE grant to do this, okay? It's an amazing experience, sitting down, listening to music, and writing a DOE grant. I don't recommend it to anybody, but you have to do it, because we want to be able to have enough resources to make this database super cool and accessible by many, many people, okay? But right now, this is the first version of our database. We're about to launch the second version, and stay tuned because it's actually really cool. So now let me move on then to another project. So let me tell you then what was great about this project. It taught us how to go to scale, right? It taught us many lessons. And some of the lessons that were actually very, very hard to learn was only do synthesizable molecules, talk to experimentalists early, right? and try to be more nimble and quick. So perhaps you don't need to calculate 3 million molecules. Maybe you need to calculate 1,000. And that's exactly the type of project that led us to this organic flow battery collaboration. Okay? So I was in the Galapagos Islands, poor me, giving a talk. And actually I saw these windmills there. Turns out these windmills produce up to 50% of the electricity of that island. Is that amazing, right? I mean, you have 3 windmills there. One of them is actually not moving right now. Okay? That's important. That's related to the next slide. But just imagine the fact that you can have an island that maybe has twice this, and that's 100% of their electricity when it's running at 100%. And that's the point of this slide. Of course, you saw that thing is not running all the time. You have wind supply, you have solar supply. And if you imagine a world where the only thing we did is put windmills and solar cells, maybe the solar cells will be made of plastic, and maybe the batteries will be the batteries that we are designing here at Harvard. But if imagine having that world, you will still have the problem again, that you actually need to store that energy, because at night there's no solar energy, right? And of course there are days that you don't get any wind, okay? And also on top of that, even you can save a lot of electricity just by modulating the grid. For example, you have a nuclear plant that is producing a lot of electricity at night. It might be a very good idea to store that electricity and release it back in the day, because you cannot shut down the nuclear plant and turn it on as quickly, okay? So again, this also leads us to like the ultimate idea that maybe people will be generating and storing their energy in their own home, okay? And this is the concept. So if you want to store energy at scale, you have to think of a battery. But that battery has to be a little bit different than the battery of your cell phone, okay? For many reasons. First of all, the cost of the chemical is something crucial, right? The cost of the chemical of your cell phone is basically, the cell phone is optimized for energy density, for example. You want to have a smaller cell phone as possible. Look at my very small iPhone 6 Plus, okay? Now, seriously, why did I select the iPhone 6 Plus? Because I want the one that has the largest battery, right? So it has to be the largest one, right? So there is a mass concept there, right? But the point here is that you could imagine, first of all, separating the power from the energy, okay? So if you want to store a lot of energy, you can make a larger and larger electrolyte tank. And then the power is where you do the electrochemistry. That's a bunch of stack of electrochemical cells. If you want to be able to draw a lot of energy from the battery, then you put more stacks. So this flow battery concept separates the chemistry from the electrochemical cell. In your cell phone, both of them are together, or in a AAA battery, both of them are together, if you think about that, right? It's all contained. Here you have these pumps that take the electrolytes from these tanks through here. And why don't we use flow batteries all the time? Well, let's listen to a wise man. What does he have to say?
As a company that provides multi-megawatt energy storage solutions using, and I have no idea what this is, vanadium redox fuel cells. That's one of the coolest things I've ever said out loud.
So, yes, so I'm his fan, and this is great. But the problem is the word vanadium, right? So as my colleague Roy Gordon likes to say, there's not enough vanadium in the world to actually, basically, that we know of, to make enough flow batteries to actually enable this renewable energy future. So we need to replace vanadium, okay? So that's where you call the theoreticians, and some of the people in this video are here, like Shang Won-soo sitting there. And then
our energy storage efforts has led.
You try to think about molecular batteries. This is actually from a promotional video of ARPA-E, which funds us for this project. And look at the chemistry. And based on our initial discussions with collaborators and colleagues, such as Ted Betley, the team actually focused on these quinones that even if you open an organic chemistry textbook, they seem to be in the right redox potential range, which has to be somewhere between 0 and 1.4 or so, okay, for molecules that actually could play the role of vanadium and replace vanadium. And molecules, of course, are much cheaper alternative. You can make them out of oil, and we still have enough oil to do this, okay? So the quinone, so what is a quinone? Quinone are molecules that have this pattern of double bonded carbon-oxygen, then conjugated with another double bonded kind of carbon-oxygen like this, usually in these rings. They are very interesting because plants use them actually as electron shuttles. They actually get electrons and donate electrons back and forth in plants. You can use them actually in your cakes, like rhubarb cakes, and they're also laxative and antibacterial. And if you really want to attract cockroaches, you can also do that with them. So they're used in biology a lot. And they're used in industry. They are actually dyes. And here at Harvard, actually, Louis Fischer already identified a very key property of them, right? He says they involve a different kind of process from such irreversible reductions. For example, the hydrogenation of ethylene and aldehydes and ketones and nitriles, okay? So even in these early papers from the 20s here from Harvard, what Louis Fischer is talking about is the fact that in certain pH conditions, you can have a 2-electron, 2-proton process readily happen in solution. So the molecule will actually take 2 protons from solution and take 2 electrons, say, from your, when you're charging it. And when you want to discharge it, it will give you back 2 protons, and it will give you back the 2 electrons. Okay, so that's why nature actually uses these guys. It's a 2-proton, 2-electron molecule. Okay. So what did we do? One of the most important things that you want to do is do machine learning. Well, I'm going to show you the most sophisticated machine learning that we did in this project. It's called linear regression. Okay, and in this particular case, inspired by a paper from the 69. Okay, so really great paper that identifies the fact that, well, if you want to learn a free energy of reduction, well, the first thing you want to think about, if the enthalpy doesn't change too much, then you just fit the, if the entropy doesn't change too much between the reactants and the products, well, just fit the enthalpy. And here are actually data for quinones in an early paper where they actually notice that this change in free energies, in enthalpies, correlates with the redox potential. Okay, so our team, based on an early calibration from 2006 and extra data from more experimental collaborators, has been doing this advanced form of machine learning called linear regression to actually find a correction toward vacuum quantum chemistry calculations to be able to predict the redox potentials of quinones with a very high success, about 1 millivolt or so of accuracy of that order of magnitude. So what my group did is actually build a library of benzoquinones, 1 ring. And you can see here, for example, the different types of substitution patterns that we did for the benzoquinones. All the different groups that actually you could attach there, from electron donating to electron withdrawing, different families of groups. And you could do the same thing for 2 antra or naphthoquinones. So I don't know what happened here. I guess my animation got messed up. But these are, for example, the anthraquinones. And for example, here, what we did in the computer is something like this, right? So we actually generated about 2,000 or so molecular pairs like this, histogram them like this, and actually see, for example, what is the right range of redox potential. This is the range of redox potential, kind of spread over different types of molecular types, or different types of anthraquinones. And actually, my slides are kind of messed up here. I apologize. So I must keep that ugly slide. I don't know what happened to it. So anyway, the whole idea is you actually look at this, because now you can see here the different types of quinones, and zoom in the right region of space. So basically the anthraquinone in this particular case, with a particular substitution pattern, work with experimental collaborators to make it, and they are the ones actually that are in the driving seat. They tell us always new things to look at, what things don't work experimentally, and so on. And then eventually come up with this molecule, anthraquinone disulfonate, as our first molecule for the low potential part of the battery. Okay? And this is basically a picture of the test cell at Harvard. This is a paper. This is, again, led by my colleague in engineering, Mike Aziz and Roy Gordon, and we collaborate with them. And some of the things that actually are very important as a theoretician is to actually come up with interesting visualizations that you want to share with colleagues. For example, in this case, this is basically the different substituent groups and how they change the redox potential. So Shangwon made this beautiful plot where you can actually see what are the most effective groups for the different types of substitution patterns for quinones to actually change the potential. And this is known to organic chemists intuitively, but it's kind of nice to also see that these patterns can be interesting for certain type of substitution patterns. There are some sort of exceptions compared to the rule. And these are the types of visualizations and the types of data that can allow our experimental colleagues to actually think of better molecules. So it's interesting because we have we believe we have a very good solution for the low potential part of the battery. But how about the high potential, right? So this was just published in the cover of Chemical Science. But how about the high potential? For that, then we need to keep using a lot of tools. And now I want to show you a tool that we've been developing in my lab called the Molecular Space Shuttle by the team over there. Tim Hirzel is actually our software engineer that developed this tool. And the Molecular Space Shuttle is a very nice tool because it allows you to actually zoom in into chemical space and see what's going on. So I'm going to show you a plot where you have stable molecules as blue. Red are unstable molecules. By unstable, I mean that the water attacks them and destroys the molecule at high potential. The x-axis will be the redox potential, and the y-axis is how soluble the molecule is. A very rough estimation of that. And we have about 100,000 molecules shown here. And this is just a scatter plot of that. What I want you to notice is that as I raise the redox potential, I see more and more unstable molecules, right? That's interesting. That's part of the challenges that we're trying to work in our collaboration, right? There might be some beautiful blue molecules here, but they're going to be much more sparse than the blue molecules in the low part of the potential that we already solved, okay? So that's an example. So what you see about our database that is really nice is this a Mongo-based database that actually contains these baseball cards for molecules. When you click on a little dot, you actually get to see the important properties of that particular molecule. And of course, this is an IACS seminar, so I couldn't resist showing you PowerPoint crash. The first thing I'm going to show you is PowerPoint crash. And I'm not going to send them crash information. And then, sorry about that. I apologize. I should use Keynote. Everybody tells me at the end of these talks that I should move to Keynote. Or Beamer. Some other people tell me they're more hippies and they want me to use latex Beamer. I'm not as hippie anymore. Okay, so let me just show you the tools that Molecular Space Shuttle allows you to do. For example, you can go in and filter. So here you see, you don't have to be reading this, but you can imagine that we went to, for example, 2-electron oxidation or reduction. You can actually cap the maximum number of substituents, something that our experimental collaborators like a lot. And then you can look at, for example, solubility constraints. And then you start looking at your library and start zooming in into the right molecules, right? Which is crucial to actually make advances. And then, again, when you actually define enough small subspace, then we like to switch to baseball cards, which are the kind of tool that we share with experimentalists, especially in our organic light-emitting diode project. We share with them every 2 weeks. And we actually look at them, and we actually discuss, which molecule is good, which molecule is bad. And sometimes they tell us all of them are horrible, and then we just have to improve and improve and improve. Okay? And this just to show you the underlying type of data structures that we need to think about here. For example, if you think about all the possible ways a molecule can be reduced and oxidized, it's a small combinatorial explosion on its own. You can see here when we're zooming in. This is a graph of all the possible ways this molecule could be reduced or oxidized between these 2 different points here. Okay? And therefore, you want to find the one that is the lowest energy pathway. But you compute them all, right? So you have to compute them all. And our database contains all these relationships amongst molecules. Okay? So now that takes me, for the final part of my talk, to the search for organic light-emitting diodes. Okay? So another technological application. This one doesn't have to do with renewable energy, but this might have implications for you in terms of lighting. So we're interested in starting to explore organic light-emitting diode lighting. Okay, so for example, drapes that power your room at night instead of just a regular light bulb. Okay, but right now we're working with Samsung. Okay, so to actually try to come up with a blue organic light-emitting diode. And it seems that doing blue diodes is actually very hard because a Nobel Prize was given for the blue inorganic diode in last year. And it's a huge market, okay? It's a market of billions of dollars, okay? And why is that? Well, because you can imagine now having organic light-emitting diode TVs, okay? Which are going to be super awesome, okay? How many of you have a Samsung phone? James must have a Samsung phone, right? No? Yes, so there's a few people that have a Samsung phone. Well, Samsung phones actually employ these organic light-emitting diodes. I heard from my colleagues there is that is because they're very bright. Of course, the dark is a true dark, unlike my iPhone that actually has a panel that lights everything and then blocks the light. Those guys basically only the colors light up, so it's very useful for being in the street. One of the problems is lifetime. These blue organic light-emitting diodes degrade very quickly. Okay, so the question is how to make them, how to find molecules that are very good and also have a very large lifetime. This is a common pattern in a lot of our projects. Organic molecule stability is key for performance. Okay? So how do the OLED work? Well, I show you a beautiful animation of how an organic solar cell works. Think about the OLED as extremely the opposite of the device. It's actually a very, very similar type of device. It also has, about 100 nanometer layer of organic molecular blend. It also has a transparent conductor. It also has a metal backplane, if you remember the other picture. But now you drive it in reverse. You actually come in with electrons, okay? About 6 volts of electrons. They come in, they meet at the molecule that localizes the excitation rather than tries to delocalize it. Boom, this readily combines and emits light. Okay, so that's how an organic light-emitting diode works. So it's basically the reverse of these organic solar cells. And what is the new interesting technology or the things that are happening? Let's talk a little bit about photochemistry. Turns out that if you actually come in with a random combination of electrons and holes, you will end up with 25% chance of the electron, the one electron coming up and one electron coming down, what is called a singlet. And a singlet is a bright state of a molecule. So if your electron and hole came in the right spin state, they will emit light. But if it hits the fan and then they come in like this, okay, then there's 75% chance of that, then become a triplet. And a triplet is not quantum mechanically allowed to emit light, at least to the first order. So therefore, this thing doesn't emit light. It will take a long time, but maybe non-radiatively, basically, don't go to the ground state without even emitting light, or emit light very, very late, very way later. Okay, so that's basically the idea of fluorescence. Is 25% of molecules will be fluorescing, but 75% of them will not do anything, and that's really bad because then the OLED proposition is not very good. So the way to solve it is to actually be able to actually have the triplets emit. Okay. And this is usually done by using transition metals. And you want to think about the physics of this. You have a very, very heavy atom with a very, very big nuclear spin, coupling of the nuclear spin with the electron spin. And now the nuclear spin can flip those triplets to singlets. Okay, and more formally, you get a mixture of the singlet and triplet states, original singlet and triplet states, and now the singlet gets a little bit of triplet, and the triplet gets a little bit of singlet character, and both of them can emit. Okay? So the problem of those transition metals, well, there's no problems, but first of all, you can see that if you keep going the transition metal path, iridium and osmium and all these compounds, you get to have like a saturation at about 1 microsecond of emission lifetime, decay time. And the biggest problem is a stability plateau also. Metal organic bonds are very weak by their own nature. So if you're actually trying to have these metals surrounded by an organic molecule and you're actually coming in with 2.5 electron volts of light, of electricity all the time, your molecule just blows up. Okay? So that's the reason why if you want to buy a molecule made of OLEDs, a TV made of OLEDs, it costs you $9,000 in Amazon. Or a little lamp costs you $4,000. Okay, I don't have that kind of money. So there was a paper that is very revolutionary by Chihaya Adachi in Japan, where he actually said, why don't we try to find molecules, and this is related to molecular space, right? Molecules that have a very particular property that maybe people didn't think could exist anymore, very much, right? If you actually have a molecule that has the electron and hole separated enough, the exchange interaction between the electron and hole is basically what determines the gap between the singlet and the triplet. If you're able to have the singlet and the triplet be roughly within KT, roughly within thermal fluctuations of each other, you might be in the triplet, which is very bad, but the triplet might have enough energy to interconvert into the singlet with a large enough rate that the singlet is emitting. Okay? The problem is that people think that when you have an electron and hole separated, the molecule is not going to be bright anymore. It's not going to emit light. It's going to be a crappy molecule for light emission. So people were thinking this was never going to work. What Chihaya Adachi found is actually that there are molecules that are, you can have the cake and eat it, right? So you can optimize for a small gap, and they still are bright enough that are useful for OLED, okay? And the rate is proportional to the spin-orbit coupling, basically the transition metal, and is inversely proportional to the singlet-triplet gap. So in other words, if you have a very small singlet-triplet gap, you're in the game again. And that's where we actually came in. We started collaborating with Samsung, Harvard, and MIT. These are the collaborators at MIT, Tim Swager, Steven Buchwald, Mark Baldo, and Troy Van Buris. Here at Harvard, in this building, Ryan Adams is our machine learning guru. and myself. And we have screened about 150,000 molecules. We have sent tens of them to synthesis. And I just want to quickly mention that the biggest important aspect is actually how to make these molecules all synthetically accessible. If you actually go and show your colleagues at industry a molecule they don't want to make, it's very hard to make, they are not very happy. They really quickly will tell you, show me only molecules that I can make. So that's part of what we did, okay? And this is actually a shout out to our colleagues at Research Computing. We actually purchased with Samsung, at the Samsung grant, this amount of computer time. And this is the amount of computer time that we have scavenged from all of you guys when your computer is when you're not using your partition of Odyssey, my group is scavenging it. So thank you very much. So keep buying nodes and don't use them, okay? Because we can actually go in there in Odyssey and, get all your free computer time. Because our calculations use, basically very small, and they can fit very well in the queue, okay? So thank you very much, all of you guys that use computers here. So we're able to actually screen about 120,000 molecules, by November. We have screened more by now. And we do exactly the same thing that we did for the Clean Energy Project. We use machine learning to accelerate and prioritize the screening of the molecules, so to only calculate the ones that are actually going to be good for OLED. And that allows us to actually solve what I like to call, first of all, accelerate the screening and also solve the synthetic accessibility puzzle, right? Where we incorporate the intuition of our experimental collaborators. We define very cleverly what are going to be the fragments they're going to be searching. We look only at molecules that are symmetrically accessible to synthesis. And we actually use cheminformatics tools to actually see how good or bad those molecules are to be synthesized. For example, this is a picture of a donor, a bridge of an acceptor, the type of building blocks, Lego building blocks that we use. You only want to have molecules that look like these, symmetric molecules. And our tools allow you to do that, for example, to only generate 9 symmetric of the 588 total combinations here. Okay, this is an example of the combinatorial. If you have smart combinatorial Lego building blocks, you will actually sift through chemical space much better. Okay? So I'm going to show you a little teaser because I don't want to tell you too many results. We're writing the paper for this. But this is one of the devices at MIT. Okay? It's called actually, anyway, it's not Bravo Prime, but here it is. So this molecule is actually predicted by us. And it was actually shown to us like that. And I love it. There's a 9-volt battery connected to this little device. And this is one of my favorite cell phone videos, okay? Only my children videos are better. So now, let me show you another thing. So you can start doing big data kind of learning the same way other companies do it. For example, companies or other groups do it. For example, the first time I heard about Tinder is when I saw one of my graduate students employed in one of my receptions. And that graduate student was actually doing this. If he liked a person, swipe to one side, and then if they didn't like the person, they swipe to the other side. Okay? Turns out that our collaboration actually employs what I like to call molecular Tinder. In the molecular space shuttle, we have a tool like that. We actually look at our molecules, and you can vote yes or no, for example, in synthesizability, or if you like it or not. So that's kind of a way of actually getting information from the experimentalist and make or not make a molecule. And then this is kind of our picture. We have people that synthesize the molecules, help us with this database, vote yes or no, like Tinder, train neural networks that actually allow us to screen molecules, and then we go to do candidates. So it's a big engine that allows us to do what we're doing. Okay? So with that, I'm going to actually have some time for questions and end with this quote that I really like from this man that I really like too. Okay? Who says that if you really want to design something, you have to actually get it. You have to grow up and know exactly what it's about. You have to have a big passion, etc. You can read it. And I think this is exactly how I think about molecular design. When I started here about 6 years ago, I thought it was going to be all easy. The only thing I needed to do was to run 3 million molecules on the grid, and then wait and see what happened, right? And then everything was going to be sorted out. And I found out that really the most important thing is to actually all the time collaborate and all the time try to improve them, and also be humble about it and be prepared for having many molecules that are not going to work, for many failures, and so on, right? So I'm very proud to say that there's now a few molecules, like the one I showed you, that one of those blue molecules of blue OLED devices that work, and that we keep trying to find, for example, these high redox potential molecules for the batteries, and so on. And I just want to give a shout out to Odyssey and the research computing team. This is Odyssey in the Harvard Yard. Hopefully it looks like that very soon. And this is a picture, a time-dependent picture of my research group and some of the papers that I've been mentioning. And some of the people, of course, are here. And with that, I want to thank you and open for questions if I still have some time. And I want to put Odyssey again. No questions? Okay. I can go to my office if not. Yeah. Okay.
Do you have any sort of techniques to screen biochemical stability? Is that so important for your
chemical stability. So, well, that's a huge, interesting thing. Actually, that's the big thing that we're doing. We have a student behind you, two blocks, Jennifer Way, that is thinking about chemical stability for batteries. Okay. In the OLED space, also, we're actually working hard to make it happen. Chemical stability can be achieved in many ways. For example, the whole idea of the temperature-assisted delayed fluorescence is TADF. It's all about the chemical stability idea, enabling a new library. In this particular case, you build a library already that you presume is going to be stable. Handles for chemical stability can be, for example, in the case of the flow batteries, the free energy of hydration of the molecules. If you know a mechanism that is going to mess up with your molecule, you can potentially calculate the energy associated with that mechanism and screen for that. And you could machine learn which molecules have or not have that property to improve your libraries. So that is one of our biggest open questions that my group is looking at. Because all these organic materials that we're talking about will make it or break it if they are stable. Yes?
Many of the properties of electronic materials depend very heavily on intermolecular interactions as opposed to intramolecular. For instance, silicon can have orders of magnitude difference in its electronic properties depending on how it's processed, although it's the same chemical.
Sure.
How do you deal with that?
Okay, so this is a very good question. So if you think of solid-state materials, blends, many of the problems that we think about, organic photovoltaic materials, the bulk dominates a lot of the properties. So I have two answers to that. Okay, and the first one is the molecule is a necessary, but not it's not necessary but not sufficient condition. If you have a good molecule, your blend might or might not work. So we focus on the first part of the question there, when the intermolecular interactions are very important. But the second part of the question is we like problems where the molecule dominates. Flow batteries, for example, the molecule is swimming in solution. You only care about the molecule. In the case of the organic light-emitting diodes, of course there is interactions with the host material, and that matter. But an organic light-emitting diode has to localize the excitation pretty much in a single molecule. So it turns out if you look at experiments, the host, yes, of course, plays a role, and you have to pick a good host, but it's not as crucial. So what we've learned is what are the problems where chemicals by themselves dominate the problem, and then we can attack them. Now, third answer to this, you can machine learn properties of the blend and the bulk. If you have properties, experimental conditions, okay, of how this blend was made or this bulk was made, etc., you can try to correlate them with machine learning, with a neural network, and sometimes things work. For example, we have noticed that the conductivity of this organic photovoltaics, the short-circuit current, which is kind of like related to the mobility, okay? If you correlate that to the structures of the molecules, you find that, for example, the high number of rotatable bonds allows the molecule to transmit better. So there can be correlations that you can find between the structure and the property without actually simulating the messy blend. Is that our weakest spot? Yes. And that's why we like to pick problems where the molecule property dominates. Yes?
Kept going to that work chart. The fourth item there was origins of life. Any brief comment on that?
Oh, yes. I put it there because I always liked, actually, Dimitri, don't leave, man. It's your work. He's like, Yeah, so I always show it as a teaser, okay? So I could have given this talk just on that, and maybe next time you invite me, we'll do that. What we're thinking about is the following. So another thing you can think about is instead of exploring molecules by themselves, you want to explore a molecular network, how molecules are connected to each other. And a very interesting question by reactions, right? And one of the interesting questions that you want to think about in the origins of life is, what are simple reactions that have very simple conditions that generate a large molecular diversity? that might be involved in the generation of the complex molecules we have in our bodies. So what we do with Dimitri actually is generate algorithms that actually very quickly explore this chemical reaction space, okay, to actually find these complex networks and then make studies about them. For example, what is the number of autocatalytic cycles in these networks that lead to complicated sugar formation and so on. So we're beginning this path in the origins of life space to use our tools, which are high throughput and computational in nature, to actually help have like some sort of bottom-up theoretical model that can hopefully match experiment. And so we're working in that space of origins of life.
So next spring you're giving.
If you want, sure, I can come anytime and tell you about origins of life. We're working more and more on that, and we're very excited. I just became official member of the Harvard Origins of Life initiative, so I'm very happy about that. So I'm an official member, my group and I, yeah. A card-carrying member, yeah. Yeah.
Anybody else?
Thank you.